at you, Governor Wolf's office, in implementing some potential gender quota requirements on your publicly held boards. So starting with a little bit of a get to know us, our mission statement. We strive daily to advocate for what is right, applying our knowledge to the fullest, most honorable extent in order to allow for mutual success. By providing sound, ethical advice, we can enable organizations in their decision-making skills as well as charting your future journey.
And then an overview of how we're going to look at this case today. We're going to start with some general background, and then we're going to move into looking at this through an ethical perspective, and then the legality of gender quotas, and then we're going to look at the financial aspects, and then we'll make our recommendations, and then finally our conclusions.
Then the idea of running the race. Picture this. You're at the 2020 Summer Olympics, and you're about to watch some of the most qualified individuals run the 400-meter dash. Now, as the race starts, you see all the runners budge up except for one that is still held into its main position. You then realize that this runner is actually shackled down into their position at a major disadvantage. So what are we to do? Do we disqualify this individual, just leaving them at the starting place? Or do we unshackle this individual and just encourage them to run their hardest and try their best to catch up to the rest of the runners? Or do we take all of these runners and bring them back to the starting point, requiring some of them to rerun the potential 100 meters that they've already covered? Now, we see that both of these perspectives puts individuals at a disadvantage. I mean, how can you expect this runner to catch up to all these other phenomenal athletes? And then on the other hand, how can you expect these fatigued runners to just restart one of the biggest races of their lives? I mean, they both seem equally as unfair. Now, we see this example as a parallel to a lot of the issues concerning us today in America. With disadvantaged groups representing the shackled runner, it is no secret that we have a disadvantaged stage for a lot of disadvantaged groups. So the question is, what are we to do about it? How can we ensure the ethicality and ensure the equality of each of these individuals? So today, we're going to be working with you to cover a few findings that we have in regards to equal opportunity and then the equal potential of representation for women on boards in Pennsylvania.
So a little background now just on women in America. So we see that even though women make up about 51% of the population, they have for a great portion of our nation's history been treated as second-class citizens. So we see that in 1920, within the last 100 years, women just gained the right to vote. And then in 1963 came the Equal Pay Act, which sought to end pay disparity and ensure equal pay for equal work. And then the Civil Rights Act of the following year. And now in 2019, women make up about 47% of the current workforce. And these have all been things that have led up to the eventual goal of equal representation and treatment.
So there we go. Now, we cannot say that there have been no strides to improvement in America. Specifically, looking at the statistic of Fortune 500 companies in 2017, we can see that 38.3% of individuals brought onto these newly named directors consisted of women. Now, as an individual aspiring for such positions, this is extremely encouraging. So today, once again, we'll be coming back with you, the Governor Wolf's office, to discuss the potential ideas and different routes, as well as drawbacks and advantages to implementing such a quota for the women of Pennsylvania in the different areas of ethicality, legality, and your financial analysis. So Michael will start with our ethical perspective.
Now, we found this picture to be a good illustration of one of our main points, because a lot of people think of equality meaning justice, but that's not necessarily correct. Here in this picture, we see that if each person were given one box to stand on, then that would be equal, but it wouldn't necessarily be just.
Now, we suggest taking on the perspective of John Rawls' two principles of liberty. The first of which being the equal liberty principle, and the second being the difference principle. Equal liberty states that all individuals can extend to all of their liberties to the fullest extent that they desire. Now, we do suggest leaning more towards the difference principle that states one of the two following. One, the most benefit should be given to those that have the least advantagement. And then two, being that all positions should be open to all individuals under the equal opportunity. Now, we also suggest keeping this in mind as we continue our presentation to ensure that at the end we make the best, most ethical decision. So as you can see, we've laid out our presentation with the with the pros and cons for each of the areas, one of which being diversity, then the acceptance and positive reinforcement in the workplace for pros for ethical.
And then under cons, we look into sort of ideas of tokenism and feelings of insecurity, and then we refer back to the question of having already ran the race from earlier.
So to start, diversity in the workplace we know is important. It can increase retention rates. It can lower the cost of potential employee turnover. And diversity in the workplace has many, many benefits across the board. As you can see here, there's clearly several different benefits of increasing diversity in the workplace, as well as the potential of when a diverse workplace is formed, every single individual's perspective is unique. So they feel that their influence is stronger and more unique for the rest of encouraging them to speak up more. Now, one of the advantages of diversity also ends up being acceptance. Now, this feeling of acceptance we all understand. We've all walked into a room where we know we belong there, and you have this stronger sense of speaking your mind, being yourself, and what I believe is the most important aspect is to make mistakes. We all know that in a world that when we make mistakes, this is something that we learn the most from. And our final positive is the idea of positive reinforcement, that these women are desired for these positions, that companies want them to come in, they understand their qualifications, as well as their support that we have for the workplace for them. Now, it also encourages women that may not already hold higher positions to strive for such a higher level of career.
And then we look at the other side of the ethical argument, starting with this idea of tokenism, because should a law requiring gender quotas be implemented in Pennsylvania for corporate boards, then that would probably increase the number of women who are put on corporate boards. And those women are almost certainly going to be qualified and professional, but having the quota might lead to a misconception amongst coworkers as to why she was put there, because they might believe that she might have only been there to satisfy the requirements of a quota and not based on her own merit. And this goes in with insecurity because women hired on corporate boards or who are already there might feel as though that they aren't there for their own merit, but are rather only there to satisfy the requirements of a state-enforced quota. And then we refer back to our question about having already ran the race, because is it fair or right for people who are already on corporate boards, female and male, who got there without the assistance of any kind of state or government-enforced quota, that other people would be given this chance or this leg up that they never had themselves?
Now, moving into our legal analysis, we started by analyzing the framework and some of the effects of very similar legislation that was recently implemented in California.
That's California Senate Bill 826, which mandates gender quotas for publicly held corporate boards in California. And we thought the language in this bill is interesting because it states specifically that woman is defined as anyone who self-identifies her gender as female without regard to sex assigned at birth. And we thought this is important because California and Pennsylvania are both very progressive states, and they both have very similar laws regarding gender identity and LGBTQ issues. And we think that it is crucial that any law enacted based on gender quota in Pennsylvania be very specific with its wording, so that it's meant to include everyone, including transgender and non-binary individuals. And then Hercules Capital is a company in California that earlier this month raised its corporate board from 8 to 9 members, adding one more woman to comply with the new law in California, which is most likely the route that most companies would take, increasing the size of their corporate board rather than getting rid of existing members.
And once again, returning back to our pros and cons, we have the guidelines of affirmative action, followed by the United States Supreme Court case versus the Virginia Military Institute, and finally, Resolution 273 that you, as a Pennsylvania government, have already implemented.
And then we look at the other side of the legal perspective, starting with the 14th Amendment, and then we look at another Supreme Court case, the case of the Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, and then we look at the Supreme Court itself.
Now, affirmative action began to manifest itself around 1961 under John F. Kennedy's presidency. Now we know that this is the concept of making right to those who were previously wrong. And in our situation, providing equality for women, we can understand that women didn't even receive the right of equal pay until 1963. So there is a clear disposition that these women are placed at, and encouraging them and ensuring that they receive the equal opportunity is something that we believe is grounds for encouraging the gender quota requirement on boards. Now, flipping over to the other side, we have the U.S. versus Virginia Military Institute Supreme Court case. There is a 7-1 ruling stating that it was unconstitutional for the Virginia Military Institute to have a male-only rule. The Supreme Court then went on to add that this prejudice against women is actually inhibiting the well-being and the success of this company in itself. And now back to you guys. As a Pennsylvania government, you are already making a huge push towards inclusivity on your executive boards, with Resolution 273 encouraging all private, public, and nonprofit organizations to subject at least 30% of their boards to be consistent of women, is a massive stride. So in order to ensure that you continue this and concretely cement the intentions that you have behind the resolution, adapting it into a law will only make it more of a binding agreement.
And then we look at the cons from the legal side, starting with the 14th Amendment, which states that no state shall deny to any person equal protection of the law. And we thought that this is important because should a law be enacted requiring gender quotas for corporate boards, requiring a minimum number of women, then this might be used to say that this is a case of reverse discrimination or discrimination against the dominant group, and that it could violate the rights of men in Pennsylvania. And then the case of the Regents of the University of California versus Bakke. Background on that, in the 70s, Alan Bakke was a white former Marine who applied twice to the University of California at Davis Medical School and was rejected twice. And he did some digging around and found that the school had set aside a certain number of seats for minority students, and that his GPA was actually higher than the average GPA of the student admitted through the minority program. And he sued the school, claiming that this violated his 14th Amendment rights, and the Supreme Court ruled narrowly in Bakke's favor. And we believe that this case might be used as a precedent to strike down any law requiring a gender quota for corporate boards. And then speaking of the Supreme Court, we thought that given the current climate of the Supreme Court itself, should a law be enacted in Pennsylvania requiring a gender quota for corporate boards, and should it be challenged in the court, and should that challenge go all the way to the Supreme Court, it would likely be ruled unconstitutional. It's most likely that Chief Justice John Roberts would be joined by Associate Justices Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, Neil Gorsuch, and Brett Kavanaugh, being the more conservative members of the court, and also having a record of usually siding with organizations and businesses, would probably vote against this type of law, whereas the four more liberal justices, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Stephen Breyer, Elena Kagan, and Sonia Sotomayor, would likely be considered toss-ups for this particular case.
And moving on to our financial analysis. After completing our research, we have found extensive reports on the financial benefit of incorporating women on your executive boards. So, coming back to our pro and con list, we found that these are the catalyst reports that we found, as well as a potential increase in shareholder buy-in and a positive market appeal.
And then on the other side, we looked at the analyst finding by Professor Al Siegley, as well as the issue of companies deciding to stay private rather than go public. And then we looked at the issue of companies leaving California.
So to start off, the Catalyst is a global nonprofit consisting of CEOs and leading companies that are all working on building a workforce that works for women and also ensures their equality. So here you can see in the Catalyst reports, we're comparing companies that have 0 women board directors with companies that have 3 or more women board directors in the area of return on sales, return on investment capital, and finally return on equity. Now these numbers are exciting to me because you can clearly see a defined percentage increase in each of the 3 areas, supporting incorporating at least 3 or more women on your board. And flipping it to the other side of this with a stronger analysis, we are analyzing the bottom quartile women board directors, so 1 to 3 women board directors on the comparison to 3 to 6 women. Once again, we see in the return on sales and return on investment capital, there is a clearly defined increase of having more women board directors rather than in the bottom quartile. And once again, in this return on equity, it's not necessarily significant, but you can see that 13% and 12% increase in just incorporating these women also proves a substantial positive for incorporating them. Now moving on to this aspect of an increased spike in shareholder buy-in. Shareholders understand that in a diverse workplace, without a diverse work board, you're going to be left at a disadvantage. It doesn't take being a multimillionaire to know that a stubborn company will not thrive in a world where we are rapidly changing and progressing every single day. And finally, our idea of market appeal. Once again, a diverse board appeals to the diverse America. Media outlets every single day are pulling from progressive companies and creating articles that are streamlined all across the internet and then directly into the hands of our consumers. Now, good or bad, this creates a stronger market presence. This market presence can then increase foot traffic in your stores, increase just customer appeal in general, and hopefully create a net positive gain of positive publicity.
And then we looked at the findings of Northwestern psychology professor and author Al Siegley, who analyzed the statistics about female board directors and said that there's room to challenge the assumption that the contributions of female directors are responsible for company success. And we thought this was important because earlier we showed some statistics of companies without any women on their corporate boards versus companies with 3 or more women, and it seemed to make a very compelling case for including more women. But it's important to think critically here because even college students know the difference between correlation and causation. It's the fact that it's hard to say conclusively because there are so many different factors that affect a company's performance that it's hard to pinpoint it solely to the fact that those companies include more women as the main factor contributing to their success. And then this idea of private versus public. Should a law enacted in Pennsylvania requiring gender quotas be applied only to publicly held companies like the law in California, then that could contribute to companies decide not to go public. Companies go public to raise capital and help them grow, but many companies are tempted just to stay private now because of the increased number of rules and regulations that are being applied to publicly held companies. And then even California, speaking of regulations in California, things that go in hand like bread and butter, in 2016, 1,800 corporations decided to pack up and leave California. And you want them to leave California, you want them to come to Pennsylvania. Now, many of those companies that left 3 years ago now, cited excessive state government regulations and rules as a contributing factor as to why they left. And there's no doubt that many people in California did see the recent law requiring gender quotas as just another business-unfriendly rule enacted by the state. And should a similar law be put in place in Pennsylvania, a lot of people are going to see it in a similar light.
Now that we have covered all of our findings and concerns, we'll delve into some recommendations that we have for you guys to create the most sound decision-making process in the end of the game. Starting with our recommendation 1. Returning back to this California legislation, we suggest that you as Pennsylvania, rather than creating a financial penalty for individuals that do not have women on their boards, rather have a financial incentive, preferably in the form of tax rate, for women that have, or for companies that have incorporated 3 or more women on their board. Now, on the other hand of this also creates a positive realm of thought when thinking about adding women to your board, rather than a disciplinary one.
And then our other recommendation is similar to the Rooney Rule in the National Football League, which states that teams are required to interview minority candidates for head coaching vacancies. And that's that companies would be required to have at least 1 out of every 4 nominees for every position be a woman. And we believe that both our recommendations are meant not to force or require companies to include more women, but rather strongly encourage that they do so.
So bring yourself back to this 2020 Summer Olympics. Now, understanding all of the disadvantages of the women in America and their commonalities to our shackled runner, what do you as Governor Wolf's office feels needs to be done? We thank you for all of your time and consideration in listening to us, and once again to reiterate that we believe the most positive reform will be brought not from strict requirements, but rather a supplementary act.
We will now take any comments or questions that you might have, and here is a list of our references. Thank you.